Can you imagine dedicating your entire existence to those you love most, only to have them systematically destroy everything you've built together? The kind of betrayal that doesn't just leave scars, but creates a hollow ache that seems to consume your very soul. My name is Dorothy, and for 40 years I wove my life into a tapestry of endless devotion. Every thread was carefully placed for my husband Robert and our son Michael. I poured everything I had into building our home, supporting Robert's climbing career, quietly setting aside my own dreams, because I believed in us, in our unbreakable family bond. But when Robert publicly paraded his younger woman around town, coldly announcing our divorce, like I was nothing more than an old business contract, my world didn't just crack, it shattered completely. The sickening truth emerged slowly, like poison seeping through my veins. Michael and his wife, Sarah, had been helping Robert for months, secretly moving our money, planning my destruction, then spreading vicious lies about affairs I never had. Yet in that crushing darkness, something unexpected stirred. They thought they'd stripped me of everything, but they'd overlooked two things: a small inheritance I'd hidden away, and my detailed diary that recorded more than they realized. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, cold and impersonal, just like the man who'd shared my bed for 4 decades. I remember standing in our kitchen, my kitchen holding those legal documents with trembling hands, the words blurring together through my tears. The home that had been my sanctuary for 40 years suddenly felt like a prison, every familiar corner now tainted with the poison of Robert's betrayal. Each room echoed with memories that now felt like mockeries. The dining room where we'd hosted countless family dinners, where Michael had announced his engagement to Sarah with such joy. The living room where Robert and I had planned our retirement dreams, talking about travel and grandchildren we'd spoil together. Now these spaces felt contaminated, as if the very walls had been complicit in their deception. Walking through our neighborhood became a gauntlet of whispered conversations and averted eyes. Mrs. Henderson, who'd borrowed sugar from me countless times over the years, suddenly found urgent reasons to duck inside when she saw me coming. The mailman Tom, who'd always stop to chat about his grandchildren and share pictures from his wallet, now barely made eye contact as he hurried past my front door. I could feel their judgment, their pity, their uncomfortable relief that this particular tragedy had struck me and not them. The isolation was suffocating in ways I'd never imagined possible. I'd wake each morning in that first confused moment of consciousness, hoping it was all some terrible nightmare, that I'd find Robert in the kitchen reading his morning paper and complaining about the coffee being too weak. Instead, I found empty rooms and echoing silence that seemed to mock the decades of laughter and conversation these walls had witnessed. The silence was so complete, it felt alive, pressing against my eardrums, until I sometimes caught myself talking aloud just to break the oppressive quiet. Robert had transformed into someone I didn't recognize, cold, dismissive, almost cruel in his calculated indifference. When I tried calling him at work, my calls went straight to voicemail. His secretary, Janet, who'd always been warm and friendly, now spoke to me in clipped professional tones, claiming he was perpetually in meetings or out of the office. The few times we did speak, he treated me like a troublesome stranger, his voice flat and businesslike, discussing our 40-year marriage like it was a failed investment he needed to liquidate as quickly and efficiently as possible. His transformation was so complete, it left me questioning my own memories. Had I ever really known this man? Had the loving husband, the devoted father, the partner who'd held my hand through my mother's funeral, ever actually existed? Or had I been living with a masterful actor for 4 decades? But what cut deepest, what felt like a knife twisting in my chest? every time I thought about it, was Michael's transformation. My son, my baby boy, who'd once cried in my arms over scraped knees and broken hearts, who'd brought me dandelions picked from our yard as if they were the most precious flowers in the world, now served as his father's enforcer. He'd show up at the house with that new cold expression I'd never seen before, making excuses for why old friends couldn't visit anymore. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly right now," he'd say, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd never heard from him before. "Dad's just trying to protect you from making things worse. You know how you get when you're upset." The way he said it, with that practiced concern that felt more like performance than genuine care, made me wonder how long he'd been rehearsing these conversations. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, who'd once called me her second mother and sent me handwritten thank you notes for every birthday gift, had perfected a particularly vicious form of kindness. She'd arrive unannounced with groceries I hadn't asked for, speaking in that sweet, syrupy voice, while her eyes remained calculating and cold, like a cat studying a wounded bird. "We've had to move some money around for the legal fees," she'd explain with that practiced expression of regret, effectively cutting off my access to accounts I'd helped build over decades. "Robert needs everything available right now for the attorneys. You understand, don't you? These things are so expensive, and we want to make sure everything is handled properly." Each conversation felt like death by 1,000 cuts, small cruelties disguised as helpful concerns. She'd reorganize my kitchen cabinets to make things easier for you, moving everything to places where I couldn't find them. She'd cancel appointments I'd made with my doctor, claiming there was confusion about my insurance, leaving me scrambling to reschedule necessary care. Despite the mounting evidence of their coordinated cruelty, part of me desperately clung to denial, like a drowning woman grasping at debris. This couldn't be my family. My Robert might be confused, maybe influenced by this new woman who'd obviously manipulated his emotions, but surely he'd come to his senses. Michael was probably just caught in the middle, trying to keep peace in an impossible situation, protecting me in ways I couldn't understand yet. I found myself making increasingly desperate excuses for their behavior, replaying decades of memories, searching frantically for signs that this was all some terrible misunderstanding, a nightmare I would eventually wake from. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the exact moment when everything had started to change, as if identifying that moment might somehow help me reverse it. The public humiliation reached its devastating peak at the Hendersons' 40th anniversary party. I debated for days whether to attend, but 40 years of friendship with Margaret Henderson won out over my shame and fear. The moment I walked through their front door, conversations died, like someone had flipped a switch. The comfortable buzz of friendly chatter simply stopped, replaced by uncomfortable silence and sideways glances. Robert stood across the room with his young girlfriend, his arm possessively around her waist, both of them laughing at something Michael had said. She was everything I wasn't anymore: young, vibrant with the kind of effortless beauty that comes from never having worried about anything more serious than which restaurant to choose for dinner. Seeing them together so comfortable and natural felt like watching my own replacement, as if I'd been nothing more than a worn-out appliance finally traded in for a newer model. When Margaret, bless her loyal heart, tried to include me in conversations with other guests, Robert made his calculated move. He approached with that politician's smile he'd perfected over the years, his girlfriend clinging to his arm like expensive jewelry he was proud to display. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet my former wife, Dorothy," he announced, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the entire room heard every word. "She's been struggling with adjusting to our new arrangements. it's been quite difficult for her to accept that some relationships simply run their course. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to diminish me while positioning him as the reasonable, long-suffering husband, finally free from a problematic marriage. Michael and Sarah flanked them like a supporting cast, offering those same patronizing smiles, nodding sympathetically as Robert painted me as unstable, irresponsible, with money, the primary cause of our marriage's inevitable failure. They'd clearly perfected this performance, refining it through multiple social occasions, making sure I felt like a shameful relic while they basked in the sympathy of our mutual friends. The cruel efficiency of it took my breath away, how thoroughly they'd planned not just my financial destruction, but my social annihilation as well. The subtle control I'd been experiencing escalated into something far more sinister and deliberate. I came home one gray afternoon to find strangers in my living room, carefully wrapping my grandmother's china in newspaper, the delicate rose-patterned set that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in my family. Each plate told a story, held memories of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, of teaching Sarah how to set a proper table when she'd first joined our family. Robert stood supervising with a clipboard in hand, as methodical as a store manager conducting inventory, his face showing no recognition of what these pieces meant to me or our family's history. "These are marital assets," he explained without even glancing in my direction, his voice devoid of any acknowledgement of the sacred memories being packed away. "We need to liquidate everything for the settlement expenses. The appraiser says the complete set should bring a decent price." Each wrapped plate felt like another piece of my history being erased, another connection to my identity being severed with calculated precision. I watched helplessly as they dismantled not just my possessions, but the very foundation of who I was. These weren't just dishes to me. They were the physical manifestation of generational love, of women who'd come before me, and the traditions they'd passed down. Sarah had been busy conducting her own form of erasure, I discovered, as I wandered through what had been my home. Every family photograph that had adorned our mantelpiece for decades, every image that showed our journey together as a family, had been methodically replaced. In their place stood carefully arranged pictures of Robert with his new girlfriend Michael, and Sarah beaming beside them, creating a completely new narrative where I simply didn't exist, where I'd never been part of this family's story. The cruelest replacement was our wedding photo, which had sat in the place of honor above the fireplace for 40 years. Now a large portrait of Robert and his girlfriend at some restaurant laughing intimately over wine glasses occupied that sacred space. Walking through my own home felt like touring a museum of someone else's life, like being a ghost haunting the shell of my former existence. But the devastating truth came through my dear friend, Eleanor, who worked as a senior analyst at First National Bank. She'd noticed some unusual activity in accounts connected to Robert's business and felt compelled to warn me despite the significant professional risk she was taking. Over coffee in a quiet corner booth at Murphy's Diner, she slid a manila folder across the table with hands that shook with nervousness. "Dorothy, I shouldn't be showing you this," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear us. "But I've known you since we were teenagers, and something about this whole situation isn't right. These patterns, they don't match what Robert's been claiming about sudden financial pressures." The documents she showed me revealed a sophisticated pattern of financial transfers that made my blood run cold. Large sums had been systematically moved from Robert's business accounts to offshore accounts that Michael had helped establish using his connections in banking. But it was the dates that told the real story. These transfers had begun nearly 2 years before Robert's announcement, long before his supposed midlife crisis, long before he'd supposedly met his young girlfriend. Page after page of bank records painted a picture of calculated, long-term planning. They'd been preparing for my destruction, methodically moving money, establishing accounts, creating paper trails that would support their eventual narrative of my supposed financial irresponsibility. This wasn't about love or passion or even midlife confusion. This was a premeditated scheme executed with the precision of professional criminals. The revelation brought back a flood of painful memories that now took on sinister new meanings. I remembered those early years when Robert's fledgling accounting practice had nearly collapsed under the weight of bad debts and poor management. Without hesitation, I'd used my entire inheritance from Daddy, $15,000, he'd specifically set aside for my security money. He'd saved by working double shifts at the textile mill to save Robert's business. I'd never asked for recognition or even mentioned it again, believing that was what marriage meant, supporting each other through difficult times, without keeping score, without expecting gratitude for doing what love required. That money had literally saved Robert's career, had been the foundation upon which he'd built his eventual success. Now, understanding that success had been used to fund my destruction felt like a desecration of everything sacred I'd believed about marriage and family loyalty. I thought about all those nights when Michael had struggled in school, when his teenage rebellion and experimentation with drugs had nearly destroyed our family's peace. While Robert worked late or attended business dinners, I was the one who'd sat with our son through his tears, who'd helped him find his way back from the darkness that had threatened to consume him. I'd sacrificed career opportunities, declined social engagements, even ended friendships that Robert deemed inappropriate for the wife of a successful businessman, all to be the mother and wife I thought they needed. Every memory now felt contaminated by the knowledge of their betrayal. Had Michael's teenage troubles been genuine, or had he been learning even then to manipulate my emotions? Had Robert's late nights really been about building his business, or had he been planning this destruction even decades ago? The uncertainty was almost worse than the confirmed betrayals. I could no longer trust any of my own memories or experiences. Now, understanding that they'd used these very sacrifices as the foundation for their betrayal felt like a complete desecration of everything I'd held sacred about family and love. Every kind act, every selfless choice, every moment I'd put their needs before my own had apparently been cataloged and calculated in their twisted plan, turned into weapons they'd eventually use against me. I confronted them that evening, my hands shaking as I held Eleanor's documents like precious evidence that might save my life. Robert sat in his leather recliner, the expensive one I'd saved for 6 months to buy him for his 50th birthday, while Michael and Sarah flanked him like professional bodyguards, their positions clearly rehearsed. The scene would have been almost comical if it weren't so heartbreaking, if it weren't the complete destruction of everything I'd spent my adult life building. "I know what you've done," I said, my voice barely steady enough to get the words out clearly. "I have proof of the transfers, the offshore accounts, all of it." Eleanor showed me everything, the timeline, the amounts, Michael's involvement in setting up the accounts. Robert's response was delivered with the same casual tone he might use to discuss whether it looked like rain. There was no surprise, no denial, no apparent concern that I'd discovered their scheme. "Dorothy, you've outlived your usefulness in my life. It's time for me to have a real relationship with someone who can keep up with my success. You're old, you're irrelevant, and frankly, You've become an embarrassment to the kind of life I want to lead now." His words were delivered with such casual cruelty that for a moment I wondered if I'd actually heard them correctly. This man who'd held my hand through my mother's funeral, who'd celebrated every birthday and anniversary with apparent joy, was dismissing 4 decades of shared life as if I'd been nothing more than a temporary inconvenience he was finally free to discard. But it was Michael who delivered the final, most devastating blow to whatever remained of my heart. My son, my baby, the child I'd carried for 9 months and loved unconditionally for 35 years, looked me directly in the eyes with an expression of cold calculation I'd never seen before. "You brought this on yourself, Mom," he said, his voice steady and practiced. "You're a burden now, and everyone knows about your affairs with that Henderson man and others. This is just the natural consequence of your choices. Dad deserves better than to be tied to someone who can't control herself." The lies about infidelity, the systematic theft, the years of careful deception, it all crystallized in that moment into something so evil I could barely comprehend it. They felt no remorse, showed no shame, displayed no recognition of the lives they'd destroyed or the woman they'd betrayed. They were completely united in their cruelty, bonded by their shared determination to erase me from their lives as efficiently as possible. Under the immediate threat of public exposure with their fabricated adultery charges, complete with manufactured evidence they claimed to possess, Robert's attorney presented me with final divorce papers. The settlement was insulting, barely enough to rent a modest apartment for 6 months, no spousal support, no claim to the business I'd helped save, no recognition of 40 years of partnership and sacrifice. But trapped in my public humiliation, isolated from friends who might have supported me with no visible means to fight back against their coordinated attack, I signed those papers with a hand that shook so violently I could barely control the pen. I watched helplessly as the last remnants of my legal protections disappeared, with each signature signing away not just money and property, but any official recognition that our marriage had ever meant anything at all. The final cruelty came exactly 1 week after I'd signed those divorce papers, arriving like the last nail in a coffin they'd been building around me for months. I returned from a trip to the grocery store, using the last of the meager cash Robert had provided for expenses, to find a locksmith methodically changing the locks on what had been my home for 40 years. Robert stood on the porch I'd planted with climbing roses back when Michael was just learning to walk, holding an official eviction notice like it was just another piece of routine paperwork he needed to process. "The house needs to be cleared immediately," he announced, without bothering to look at me, his voice carrying that same businesslike tone he'd used to discuss tax deadlines with clients. "Your belongings are on the curb. You have exactly 1 hour to collect whatever you can physically carry before the waste management company arrives." The sight that greeted me was the complete destruction of a lifetime. 40 years of memories sat in hastily packed cardboard boxes on the sidewalk like garbage, waiting for pickup, treated with no more care than if they'd been clearing out a storage unit. My wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, lay crumpled in a box marked miscellaneous clothing. Photo albums documenting Michael's entire childhood, his first steps, his Little League games, his high school graduation, where he'd thanked me in his speech for always believing in him, were scattered among boxes of kitchen utensils and old magazines. Christmas ornaments we'd collected from every vacation, each one holding a story of where we'd been and what we'd dreamed about together, had been carelessly thrown together in a box that was already splitting at the seams. The wooden angel Michael had made for me in 3rd grade shop class, its painted face worn smooth by decades of my fingers, tracing its features every December lay broken at the bottom of a pile of miscellaneous decorations. Neighbors peered from behind curtains and through partially open doors as I sorted through the remnants of my life, trying to salvage what little dignity remained, while the entire street witnessed my complete humiliation. Mrs. Patterson from next door eventually came over, her face flushed with embarrassment and righteous anger on my behalf. "This is wrong, Dorothy," she whispered urgently, glancing toward Robert, who stood watching from the porch like a supervisor ensuring his orders were carried out properly. "Everyone on this street knows this is wrong. A woman doesn't just lose everything after 40 years of marriage. There has to be something you can do." But wrong or not, I was homeless. At 62 years old, with my entire adult life reduced to 2 suitcases containing everything I had left in the world, I found myself sitting on a park bench in the town square where Robert and I had once brought Michael to feed the ducks when he was small. The physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the emotional devastation that threatened to consume me entirely. I couldn't eat anything without my stomach immediately rejecting it. Sleep became impossible as my mind replayed every moment of betrayal, every sign I should have seen, every opportunity I'd missed to protect myself. Most frightening of all, I couldn't see any reason to continue fighting, any point in getting up from this bench and trying to rebuild a life from absolutely nothing. The bench became my entire world for 3 endless days and nights. I watched families walk by with their children, couples holding hands and making plans for their futures, teenagers complaining about problems that seemed impossibly trivial compared to the complete destruction of everything I'd built over 4 decades. The crushing weight of injustice pressed down on me until even breathing became difficult, each breath requiring conscious effort, as if my body was forgetting how to perform its most basic functions. During those dark hours, I found myself questioning everything I'd ever believed about fairness, about love, about the basic goodness that I'd thought existed in people. How could a son destroy his own mother so completely? How could a man who'd shared my bed for 40 years feel absolutely nothing as he stripped away every vestige of security I'd ever known? The scope of their cruelty was so vast, I couldn't comprehend. It couldn't find any framework in my experience that helped me understand how such calculated evil was possible. That's when Eleanor found me on the 3rd evening, her face etched with worry as she approached the bench where I'd been sitting like a broken statue. My childhood friend, now a retired financial advisor, who'd spent her career helping people navigate life's challenges, had been searching the entire downtown area after hearing about my eviction through the neighborhood gossip network. Seeing the complete devastation written across my face, she sat beside me without saying a word for what felt like hours. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle, but carried a firmness that cut through the fog of my despair. "Dorothy, I need you to focus on my voice for just a moment," she said, taking my cold hands in her warm ones. "Do you remember that conversation we had about 5 years ago? You were worried about Robert's business going through some rough patches, and you mentioned putting some money aside just in case things got really bad. You called it your Aunt Martha Fund, after that unexpected inheritance from your mother's sister." The memory came flooding back through the haze of my grief, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Aunt Martha, my mother's eccentric older sister, who'd lived like a pauper in a tiny apartment, but had apparently saved every penny she'd ever earned working as a seamstress. When she passed away unexpectedly, leaving no will, she'd left me a modest inheritance of $8,000 that I'd quietly tucked away in a separate account, telling no one except Eleanor during one of our heart-to-heart conversations. I'd opened that account at a different bank across town, something I'd never mentioned to Robert, because it felt like a small piece of independence, a tiny safety net that was completely my own. It wasn't a fortune by any means, but it was something Robert and his conspirators didn't know about, something they couldn't steal or manipulate or use against me. And your diary, Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger as she saw recognition dawning in my eyes. You've always said it was your way of making sense of things, writing down conversations and dates and financial discussions that confused you. You might not realize it, Dorothy, but you've been documenting their deception for years without even knowing it. That diary, my faithful companion, that I'd filled with what I thought were mundane observations about daily life, suddenly took on profound new significance. Every entry about Robert's mysterious business meetings that seemed to produce no new clients, every note about Michael's subtle questions regarding our financial arrangements, every record of their whispered conversations I'd half overheard from the kitchen, it was all there, creating a detailed breadcrumb trail of their systematic betrayal. I'd written about the strange phone calls Robert would take in his office, with the door closed, conversations that would stop abruptly when I entered the room. I'd recorded my confusion about checks that had gone missing from our joint account money that Robert claimed had gone to business expenses that never seemed to materialize into actual business growth. I documented Sarah's increasing interest in our financial planning, her seemingly innocent questions about insurance policies and retirement accounts that now seemed far from innocent. Something fundamental shifted inside me that evening as Eleanor helped me retrieve my diary from the boxes they'd so carelessly discarded. It wasn't hope exactly, because hope seemed too fragile and optimistic for what I was feeling. Instead, it was something harder and more determined, something forged in the absolute depths of despair and tempered by the complete destruction of everything I'd once trusted. They'd counted on my being too broken, too ashamed, too isolated to fight back effectively. They'd assumed that a woman my age, stripped of her home and financial resources, would simply disappear, quietly grateful for whatever scraps they were willing to throw her way. They'd underestimated the quiet strength that comes from having absolutely nothing left, to lose the fierce determination that can emerge when someone realizes they've been systematically destroyed by the very people they'd trusted most. Eleanor helped me find a small apartment above Murphy's Diner, the same modest restaurant where she'd first shown me the evidence of their theft. It was humble, just 2 small rooms with a kitchenette and a bathroom that had seen better days, but it was mine. The rent was reasonable enough that Aunt Martha's inheritance could cover it for several months, giving me time to figure out my next steps. As I sat at the small scratch table that first night, reading through months of diary entries by the light of a secondhand lamp Eleanor had helped me buy, I felt something I hadn't experienced in what felt like years, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. The patterns that emerged from my careful documentation were undeniable, creating a timeline of deception that even they would have difficulty explaining away. This wasn't about revenge, though I'd be lying if I said the thought hadn't crossed my mind during those darkest hours on the park bench. This wasn't even about getting back the money and property they'd stolen, though I certainly deserved compensation for their theft. This was about something far more precious and fundamental, the right to be remembered as the woman I actually was, not the fictional character they'd created to justify their cruelty. They'd painted me as a bitter, unstable woman, having affairs with neighbors, someone whose word couldn't be trusted, whose version of events was tainted by mental instability and moral failure. But I had documentation, careful records. that told a completely different story, the story of a devoted wife and mother who'd been systematically betrayed by the very people who should have protected her. The seed of reluctant action had been planted in the fertile ground of absolute injustice. I wasn't fighting for wealth or possessions anymore because I'd learned that those things could be taken away in an instant by people willing to lie and cheat. I was fighting for something that couldn't be stolen, the truth about who I was and what I'd contributed to our family. And for the first time since this nightmare, began sitting in my tiny apartment with my diary spread before me. Like evidence in a case, I was finally ready to build. I felt like I might actually have the strength and the documentation to see this fight through to whatever end awaited me. The first step toward reclaiming my dignity was perhaps the most agonizing decision I'd ever made. Using precious funds from Aunt Martha's inheritance, I secured my tiny apartment above Murphy's Diner and hired the lawyer Eleanor had recommended, a quiet, methodical woman named Catherine Walsh, who specialized in complex financial fraud cases. Catherine wasn't the type of attorney who made grand speeches in courtrooms or appeared on television. Instead, she was known for her tenacious, painstaking investigations that slowly, carefully exposed the truth, like an archaeologist uncovering ancient secrets. Each consultation with Catherine felt like tearing open fresh wounds that had barely begun to heal. Sitting in her modest office, recounting the systematic betrayal by Robert and Michael, articulating the depth of their deception to a stranger, required me to relive every moment of their cruelty. The words stuck in my throat as I tried to explain how my own son had helped orchestrate my destruction, how the man I'd loved for 40 years had planned my devastation with the same careful attention he'd once given to our anniversary celebrations. "Mrs. Morrison," Catherine would say gently, using my maiden name at my request, "I know this is difficult, but every detail matters. Your diary entries are extraordinarily valuable, but I need you to help me understand the context of each conversation, each suspicious transaction you recorded. The knowledge that I was pursuing legal action against my own family felt like a betrayal of everything I'd been raised to believe about loyalty and forgiveness. But the desire to clear my name, to reclaim some shred of the dignity they'd systematically destroyed, pushed me forward through each painful session. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking truth and the right to be remembered as the woman I actually was, rather than the fiction they'd created. When Robert's high-powered legal team received the first formal inquiries from Catherine's office, their reaction was predictably dismissive. Through mutual acquaintances, word filtered back to me about Robert's casual contempt for my efforts. Dorothy's still clinging on like a desperate woman. He'd reportedly told his young girlfriend during a dinner party at what had been our home, "It's honestly pathetic how she can't accept that her time is over." Michael and Sarah were equally dismissive, spreading rumors throughout their social circles that this was simply my last desperate attempt to extort money from a family that had already been more than generous with me. They painted me as a bitter, senile woman who couldn't accept the natural end of a marriage, someone grasping at straws and fabricating evidence out of spite and mental instability. Their confidence was absolute. They saw me as a defeated woman with no real resources, utterly convinced that I was powerless to challenge their carefully constructed scheme. The arrogance in their dismissal was breathtaking. They showed utter contempt for any effort I made to seek justice, treating my legal action like an inconvenient nuisance rather than a serious threat to their carefully laid plans. But Catherine's quiet, methodical work began producing results that surprised even me. Using the detailed dates and seemingly innocuous observations from my diary, she started tracing financial patterns that told a very different story than the one Robert had presented in our divorce proceedings. Her investigative team, working with forensic accountants, began following paper trails that my careful documentation had inadvertently preserved. The first breakthrough came when Catherine's team uncovered a small investment property that Robert had purchased with Michael's assistance, using funds that should have been disclosed during our divorce proceedings. It wasn't a massive discovery. The property was worth perhaps $50,000, but it represented a tangible breach of their legal obligations, a concrete crack in the armor of their supposedly legitimate financial picture. When Catherine called to tell me about the discovery, I expected to feel vindicated, perhaps even triumphant. Instead, I felt only a deep, chilling sadness. This wasn't a victory to celebrate. It was confirmation of my worst fears, undeniable proof that their betrayal had been even more systematic and calculated than I'd imagined. The small legal win felt like attending the funeral of the family I'd believed I had, making the irreversible damage to our relationships undeniably real. This is just the beginning, Dorothy, Catherine assured me over the phone. If they hid one property, there are likely others. Your diary has given us a roadmap that they never expected us to have. But Robert, Michael, and Sarah weren't about to accept even this small setback quietly. Their retaliation was swift and vicious, revealing the full extent of their capacity for cruelty. They intensified their smear campaign against me, feeding carefully crafted stories to local gossip networks and even a small regional newspaper known for its sensational coverage of local scandals. The stories they spread were devastating in their detail and apparent authenticity. They painted me as a woman who'd been having affairs for years, someone who'd been recklessly spending family money on frivolous purchases and secret indulgences. Michael publicly accused me of fabricating evidence and suffering from age-related mental deterioration that made my accusations unreliable and potentially dangerous. They hinted at filing countersuits against me for harassment and defamation, positioning themselves as the wronged parties who were simply trying to move on with their lives, while a vindictive ex-wife and unstable mother made their existence miserable with baseless accusations. Their coordinated response revealed a sophisticated understanding of public relations and legal strategy that chilled me with its implications. Sarah proved particularly adept at this campaign of character assassination, using her natural charm and apparent sincerity to spread their version of events through social networks I'd once been part of. She would approach former friends of mine with expressions of concern and regret sharing confidential information about my supposed mental state and the difficult position my behavior was putting the entire family in. The emotional toll of fighting this battle while simultaneously defending my reputation and sanity was exhausting in ways I'd never experienced. Each day brought new evidence of their systematic campaign to discredit me, new examples of how thoroughly they'd planned not just my financial destruction, but my complete social annihilation. The weight of conflict, the constant vigilance required to defend myself against their attacks, left me feeling older and more fragile than I'd ever felt before. Yet beneath the weariness and sadness, something harder was crystallizing within me, a grim determination that had nothing to do with anger or revenge, and everything to do with simple justice. They'd underestimated the quiet strength that comes from having nothing left to lose, the fierce clarity that emerges when someone realizes they're fighting not for comfort or security, but for the basic right to exist with dignity and truth. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Catherine had filed our initial legal documents, I found myself walking down Maple Street toward the house that had been my home for 40 years. I hadn't planned this pilgrimage. My feet had simply carried me there during what was supposed to be a routine walk to clear my head after another difficult session reviewing financial documents with Catherine. The sight that greeted me was like viewing the corpse of a life I'd once cherished. The garden I had lovingly tended through 4 decades of seasons was neglected, and overgrown weeds choking out the perennial flowers I'd carefully selected and nurtured over the years. The climbing roses I'd trained along the front fence had been left unpruned, their once graceful branches now tangled and wild blooms few and far between. The porch swing, where Robert and I had spent countless evenings planning our future, discussing Michael's progress in school, sharing our dreams for retirement, hung broken and abandoned. One of its chains had snapped, leaving it tilted at an angle that made it look wounded like a bird with a broken wing. The sight of it triggered a wave of nostalgia so sharp and painful it literally took my breath away, mingling crushing sorrow for the life that had been with rage at how carelessly they'd discarded everything I'd built. Through the living room window, I could see evidence of how completely they'd erased my presence from the space I'd created with such love and attention. Robert's new girlfriend had redecorated with garish modern furniture that clashed violently with the traditional style I'd spent years perfecting. Bright angular pieces in harsh colors had replaced the antique furniture I'd lovingly restored pieces that had held family history and memories of special occasions when we'd saved to purchase something beautiful together. Michael's new sports car, a sleek, expensive convertible that must have cost more than I'd spent on household needs in an entire year, was parked carelessly on the front lawn, its tires leaving deep ruts in the grass I'd once maintained like a carpet. The casual disrespect this represented the complete disregard for the care I'd invested in every inch of that property, felt like a physical assault on my heart. They had painted over the delicate floral wallpaper in the front hall wallpaper I'd selected and hung myself during those early years when we couldn't afford professional decorators. The hand-painted roses that had taken me weeks to complete were now buried under bold stripes that seemed to shout rather than welcome. A cheap plastic outdoor furniture set had replaced the antique garden bench my mother had given us as a wedding gift, the wooden seat where I'd nursed Michael through childhood illnesses and read him stories on summer evenings. As I stood there absorbing this casual desecration of my memories, trying to reconcile the house before me with the home that lived in my heart, Michael emerged from the front door. He was dressed in expensive new clothes, a cashmere sweater and tailored pants that spoke of newfound prosperity, and his face, once so familiar and beloved to me, was transformed by an expression of cold hardness I'd never seen before. His eyes held a chilling detachment that seemed to look right through me, as if I were a stranger who'd wandered onto his property rather than the woman who'd carried him for 9 months and loved him unconditionally for 35 years. The warmth that had once lit up his features when he saw me, the automatic smile that had greeted me throughout his childhood and young adulthood, had been replaced by something that made him look like a stranger wearing my son's face. He sauntered toward me with a smirk playing on his lips, his body language radiating confidence and contempt in equal measure. When he spoke, his voice carried a tone of condescension that cut through me like a knife. "Still lurking around here, Mom?" He said the word "Mom" delivered with such casual cruelty, it made me flinch. "It's honestly pathetic. You really should move on with whatever's left of your life. This is our life now, and you're not part of it anymore." He gestured broadly toward the house, taking obvious pleasure in displaying his ownership of the space that had once been mine. "You're causing so much unnecessary trouble with your ridiculous accusations and your desperate legal games. Robert and Sarah are very happy together. They're building something real here, something positive, while you're just a bitter old woman who can't accept that she got exactly what she deserved. Each word was carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, delivered with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to strike to cause the deepest pain. He was reveling in my hurt, twisting the knife deeper with every syllable, dismissing not just my current situation, but the entire lifetime of love and sacrifice I'd invested in our family. Why do you insist on clinging to what isn't yours anymore? He continued, his voice growing harder. This house, this life, this family, none of it belongs to you now. You made your choices, you lived your life, and now it's over. If you keep interfering with our happiness, we'll have to take more serious legal action to protect ourselves. The threat was clear, delivered with the same casual tone he might use to discuss the weather. This wasn't my son speaking. This was a stranger who happened to share DNA with me, someone who'd been transformed by greed and manipulation into a person I didn't recognize and couldn't reach. But as I stood there listening to his cruel words, something unexpected happened. Instead of crumbling under his assault, I felt a quiet strength rising within me, a dignity that their cruelty couldn't touch. I met his gaze directly, my eyes dry, my voice steady, despite the pain his words had caused. "This home," I said, pointing to a small, struggling rose bush near the front walkway, one of the original plantings I'd put in when we'd first moved here, was built on love, not greed. And some things, Michael, cannot be bought or stolen, no matter how much money you think you have. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope I'd been carrying for weeks, not really knowing why. Inside were seeds I'd collected from those very roses during happier times, seeds I'd saved with some vague notion of planting them someday in a garden of my own. Without another word, I walked to the struggling bush and scattered the seeds around its base, a quiet, defiant act of reclaiming my connection to this place and asserting my enduring spirit. The gesture wasn't grand or dramatic, just an elderly woman planting flower seeds on a Tuesday afternoon. But it represented something profound to me, the understanding that while they could steal my possessions and destroy my relationships, they couldn't erase the love I'd invested in this place, or the person I'd been while creating it. Michael watched this small ceremony with obvious irritation and confusion, clearly not understanding the significance of what I was doing. To him, it probably looked like the desperate action of a woman who'd lost her grip on reality. But to me, it was a declaration that some part of my spirit remained unbroken, that their betrayal couldn't completely destroy the essence of who I was. The quiet investigation that Catherine had been conducting for weeks suddenly escalated into formal legal proceedings that consumed my life with their intensity and complexity. What had begun as careful document review and discreet inquiries transformed into depositions, court filings, and formal discovery processes that forced me to relive every moment of betrayal in excruciating legal detail. Each court appearance became an emotional ordeal that left me drained and shaken. Sitting in those sterile courtrooms facing Robert, Michael, and Sarah across the aisle, while their expensive legal team worked to discredit everything I said, felt like being slowly dissected by professionals who understood exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining the appearance of legitimate legal process. Robert had hired one of the most aggressive law firms in the state attorneys, known for their willingness to use any tactic necessary to protect their clients' interests. They were skilled at making victims look like perpetrators, at twisting honest testimony into evidence of mental instability or malicious intent. Watching them work was like observing predators who'd perfected their hunting techniques through years of practice. The strategy they employed was sophisticated and brutal in its effectiveness. Rather than simply denying the charges against their clients, they launched a comprehensive assault on my credibility and mental state. They presented what appeared to be a carefully constructed collection of evidence designed to support their narrative of me as an unstable, vindictive woman whose accusations stemmed from age-related cognitive decline and an inability to accept the natural end of her marriage. Forged documents began appearing in their filings, bank statements that seemed to show patterns of reckless spending on my part, credit card records, indicating purchases of expensive items I'd never bought, even what appeared to be receipts from romantic restaurants where I'd supposedly entertained male companions during my marriage. The sophistication of these fabrications was terrifying, revealing a level of planning and resources that made my small legal effort seem almost pathetically inadequate. They produced witness statements from people I'd never met, individuals who claimed to have observed my supposed affairs or erratic behavior over the years. These witnesses, when questioned by Catherine, proved to have suspiciously vague memories and stories that fell apart under scrutiny, but their initial impact was devastating to my reputation and emotional state. Most painful of all were the ways they twisted genuine events from our family history to support their false narrative. A time when I'd gone through a period of sadness after my mother's death became evidence of long-term mental instability. My natural grief over the deterioration of my marriage was presented as proof of an unbalanced personality that made me unsuitable as a reliable witness to anything. Sarah proved particularly effective at this character assassination, presenting herself as a concerned daughter-in-law who'd tried for years to help Michael deal with an increasingly difficult mother. Her testimony was delivered with apparent sincerity and just the right amount of reluctant sadness, painting me as a burden the family had carried out of loyalty and love until it became impossible to continue. But Catherine's methodical work had been building toward this moment for months. Armed with my detailed diary entries and the financial patterns they revealed, she'd been quietly assembling a case that went far beyond my personal observations. Her forensic accountants had traced money trails that painted a very different picture of Robert and Michael's activities, revealing a pattern of financial manipulation that was both sophisticated and clearly illegal. The breakthrough came when Catherine's persistent inquiries reached a former junior accountant who'd worked in Robert's firm during the crucial period when the offshore accounts were being established. This young man, whose conscience had been troubled by what he'd witnessed, provided testimony that corroborated the timeline and specific details my diary had documented. His statement revealed that Robert and Michael had spent months planning the complex financial maneuvers that would strip me of assets while protecting their own interests. He'd seen documents, overheard conversations, and even been asked to perform calculations related to their scheme. Most damaging of all, he could testify to specific dates when these plans were discussed, dates that proved their deception had begun long before Robert's supposed midlife crisis or his meeting with his young girlfriend. When Catherine presented this evidence to the court, the effect was immediate and devastating. The judge's expression hardened as she reviewed bank records that showed clear patterns of concealment and fraud. Robert, Michael, and Sarah's faces turned ashen as they realized their carefully constructed lies were crumbling under the weight of documentation they'd never expected to surface. The evidence of their systematic financial fraud was laid out with scientific precision: transfer dates, account numbers, amounts that had been moved and hidden, all corroborated by my diary entries and the accountant's testimony. The sheer premeditation of their actions, the months of planning that had gone into my destruction, was exposed in cold, hard facts that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away. More damaging still were the glaring inconsistencies in their fabricated evidence of my supposed infidelities and mental instability. When Catherine's team examined the forged documents more closely, they found metadata and printing inconsistencies that revealed when and how they'd been created. The witness statements began falling apart when the supposed witnesses couldn't provide basic details about their claims or were revealed to have financial connections to Robert's business. The judge's reaction was swift and decisive. She ordered the immediate freezing of certain assets that Catherine's investigation had uncovered, including the hidden investment property and several offshore accounts that had been established without my knowledge. She also recommended a full forensic audit of Robert's business finances and hinted strongly that she was considering referring the case to prosecutors for potential criminal charges related to financial fraud and perjury. Robert, Michael, and Sarah sat in stunned silence as their ambitious plans for wealth and their carefully crafted new lives suddenly faced serious legal jeopardy. Their rage was palpable. I could see it in the set of their shoulders, the way they avoided looking in my direction, the urgent whispered conferences with their attorneys. But their legal options were rapidly diminishing as the evidence mounted against them. Despite this clear legal vindication, I felt no triumph, no sense of victory or satisfaction. Instead, I felt utterly drained, hollow, and profoundly sad in ways that went deeper than any emotion I'd experienced during this entire ordeal. The win wasn't something to celebrate. It was a bitter confirmation of my deepest, most agonizing fears about the people I'd loved most. Sitting in that courtroom, watching the judge systematically dismantle their lies and expose their crimes, felt like attending the official funeral of the family I had loved and believed in for 40 years. These formal legal proceedings weren't just about money or property. They were marking the definitive, irreparable end of relationships that had once been the foundation of my entire existence. The air in the courtroom felt heavy with the weight of shattered dreams and a stolen life, thick with the sadness of love betrayed and trust destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. I'd won a legal battle, but I'd lost something far more precious, the illusion that the people I'd devoted my life to had ever truly loved me in return. 3 days after the judge's devastating ruling, I was sitting in my small apartment above Murphy's Diner, trying to process the strange emptiness that legal vindication had brought when I heard urgent knocking at my door. Through the peephole, I saw them, Robert, Michael, and Sarah, standing in the narrow hallway, looking more desperate and disheveled than I'd ever seen them. When I opened the door, Robert immediately stepped forward, his face a mask of panic, barely contained beneath a veneer of forced calm. The man who dismissed me so cruelly just weeks earlier was now pleading with his eyes before he even spoke, his hands shaking slightly as he gestured toward me. "Dorothy, please." He began, his voice cracking with an emotion I couldn't quite identify as genuine. This whole legal situation has gotten completely out of hand. We never intended for things to go this far, and now everyone's going to suffer because of a simple misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. He was still handsome at 65, still possessed of the charm that had first attracted me all those decades ago, but now those qualities felt like stage makeup, hiding something rotten underneath. His eyes darted around my modest apartment, taking in the second-hand furniture and cramped quarters, and I could see him calculating, trying to determine what approach might work with a woman who now had so little to lose. "Remember our life together. he continued, his voice taking on the warm tone he'd once used when we were planning our future. Remember all those wonderful years, all the dreams we shared, all the love we built together. This legal battle is destroying everything we created, Dorothy. Please don't let lawyers and court proceedings erase 40 years of marriage and family. Michael stood beside his father, his face streaked with tears that might have been genuine, his voice cracking as he spoke. Mom, please think about what this is doing to all of us, to the family name we've all worked so hard to build. You don't really want to see me and Sarah lose everything, do you? I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you, but we're still family. That has to count for something. His tears were the hardest part to witness because for a moment he looked like the little boy who'd run to me with scraped knees and broken toys, seeking comfort and reassurance that everything would be okay. But I forced myself to remember that this same person had systematically planned my destruction, had helped orchestrate the theft of everything I'd worked for, had publicly humiliated me with lies about affairs I'd never had. Sarah, positioned slightly behind the men, maintained her carefully crafted expression of sorrowful regret, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while looking at me with what appeared to be genuine remorse. Dorothy, I know we've all made terrible mistakes, and I take full responsibility for my part in this whole mess. But please think about what a prolonged legal battle will do to everyone involved. Can't we find a way to resolve this privately, as a family? They were appealing to every vulnerable part of my heart. The wife who'd once loved Robert unconditionally, the mother who'd always put Michael's welfare above her own, the woman who'd been raised to value family loyalty above all else. They were exploiting the very love they'd betrayed, using my own capacity for forgiveness as a weapon against me. But as I looked at them standing in my doorway, I felt something I'd never experienced before in relation to my family: complete emotional detachment. It wasn't anger or hatred. Those emotions would have indicated that they still had the power to affect me deeply. Instead, it was a profound, sorrowful recognition that the people I was looking at were strangers wearing the faces of people I'd once loved. Robert, I said, my voice quiet but steady. The trust you shattered, the dignity you stole, the son you corrupted with your greed, there's nothing left to salvage here. You made a deliberate choice to destroy me rather than simply ending our marriage with honesty and fairness. You chose calculated cruelty over basic human decency. I turned to Michael, this man who'd once been my baby, my pride and joy, my hope for the future. You were my son. I carried you, raised you, sacrificed, for you believed in you even when you made mistakes. And you chose to bury me alive rather than simply walking away. There is no coming back from that choice, Michael. There is no road that leads back to being mother and son after what you've done. The words came from a place deeper than anger, from a well of sadness so profound it felt like speaking from the bottom of an ocean. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. This was about acknowledging a reality that no amount of tears or apologies could change. The bonds between us hadn't just been damaged, they'd been deliberately destroyed by their own actions, poisoned beyond any possibility of healing. You're asking me to pretend that none of this happened. I continued, looking at each of them in turn. You want me to forget the months of systematic abuse, the lies you told about me, the way you stripped away everything I'd built and left me homeless and penniless. You want me to protect you from the consequences of your own choices. The manipulation in their desperate plea was transparent, now visible in the way they positioned themselves, in the calculated timing of their tears, in the careful selection of words designed to trigger my maternal instincts and spousal loyalty. They weren't sorry for what they'd done. They were sorry they'd been caught, sorry that their carefully laid plans were crumbling around them. After they left, defeated and angry, I sat in the gathering darkness of my small apartment, clutching an old wedding photograph I'd managed to salvage from the boxes they'd discarded. In the picture, Robert and I looked so young, so hopeful, so completely convinced that we were building something that would last forever. The love in our faces was genuine, undeniable, and looking at it now felt like viewing artifacts from a lost civilization. A profound grief washed over me as I allowed myself to imagine for just a few moments what our life could have been if Robert had remained the man I'd married. I pictured growing old together with dignity and grace, becoming grandparents who spoiled their grandchildren and shared stories of their long, happy marriage. I imagined Michael as the honorable man I'd raised him to be, someone who protected and cared for his aging parents rather than exploiting their vulnerabilities. The life that could have been shimmered before me like a mirage, beautiful and heartbreaking in its impossibility. We could have faced the challenges of aging together, supported each other through health scares and losses, celebrated anniversaries and milestones as a family that actually loved and protected its members. Instead, they'd chosen a path that led to this moment, legal battles and broken relationships that could never be repaired. But dwelling on what might have been was a luxury I could no longer afford. The family I'd nurtured and believed in existed only in my memories and in photographs like the one I held. The people who shared those memories had chosen to become something else, entirely something incompatible with the love and trust that families require to survive. With the legal process moving forward to ensure their financial accountability, I made a decision that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I legally changed my last name back to Morrison, my maiden name shedding the identity I'd shared with Robert for 40 years. The paperwork was simple, but the emotional weight of signing away the name I'd carried through marriage, motherhood, and 4 decades of shared life felt like performing surgery on my own heart. I also gave away the remaining small trinkets and mementos that connected me to them, wedding gifts, family photos, even the few pieces of jewelry Robert had given me over the years. I donated everything anonymously to local charities, wanting these objects to bring joy to someone else, rather than serving as constant reminders of love betrayed. Finally, I formally requested that all future correspondence from them or their attorneys be directed exclusively to Catherine's office. I would no longer accept phone calls, letters, or personal visits from any of them. This wasn't cruelty. This was self-preservation, the recognition that some wounds are too deep to heal and some betrayals too profound to forgive. The act felt like burying a part of my life, like conducting a funeral for a family that no longer existed, cutting the last threads of bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. But in that symbolic severance, I also found a strange kind of peace, the heavy, aching peace that comes from finally accepting an unbearable truth and choosing to move forward anyway. The forensic audit that Catherine had initiated continued its methodical work long after our courtroom victory, and its findings eventually became too significant to remain confined to legal proceedings. What began as a private family matter transformed into a public revelation that shocked our entire community in ways I'd never anticipated. When the local newspaper, the Valley Herald, first picked up the story, I was terrified about how they'd portray the situation. The media had been sympathetic to Robert, initially painting him as a successful businessman, going through a difficult divorce with an unstable wife. But now faced with documented evidence of systematic fraud, and the complete fabrication of adultery charges. Their tone shifted dramatically. The headline read, "Local accountant and son orchestrated elaborate fraud against wife and mother." The article detailed the sophisticated financial manipulation that had been uncovered, the offshore accounts, the hidden properties, and most damaging of all, the deliberate creation of false evidence to destroy my reputation. The reporter had done thorough research interviewing the former employee who'd provided crucial testimony and even speaking with neighbors who'd witnessed my character over 40 years. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People who'd known our family for decades expressed shock and outrage that grew with each new detail that emerged. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been quietly uncomfortable with the whispered stories about my supposed affairs, now spoke openly about how she'd never believed them, how they'd never aligned with the woman she'd known for so many years. The phones at Robert's accounting firm began ringing constantly, but not with new business inquiries. Longtime clients were demanding explanations, wanting to know if their own finances had been manipulated or if they could trust a man who'd so systematically betrayed his own wife. Several major accounts were canceled within the first week after the story broke. But it was the community response that truly revealed the extent of Robert Michael and Sarah's fall from grace. The country club where Robert had been a member for 20 years and had often entertained clients quietly suggested that he might want to consider resigning his membership. The suggestion was polite, but firm. His presence was making other members uncomfortable, and his continued association with the club was damaging their reputation. Michael's business dealings suffered immediate and severe consequences. He'd built his banking career partly on the family's reputation for integrity and solid financial management. Now potential clients saw his name in the newspaper connected to fraud and elder abuse, making him essentially unemployable in the local financial sector. The professional licenses he'd worked years to obtain were under review by state banking authorities who didn't appreciate the negative attention his case was bringing to their industry. Sarah faced her own form of social exile. The women's organizations she'd joined, the charity boards, where she'd served, the social circles she'd cultivated so carefully, all of them began finding reasons why her continued participation might not be appropriate. Her carefully constructed image as a devoted daughter-in-law and community leader crumbled under the weight of documented evidence showing her active participation in destroying an elderly woman's life. Perhaps most devastating for Robert was watching his relationship with his young girlfriend disintegrate under the pressure of public scrutiny. She'd been attracted to a successful, respected businessman with financial security and social standing. Now she found herself linked to a man facing potential criminal charges, social ostracism, and financial ruin. The glamorous life he'd promised her had transformed into a nightmare of legal bills and public humiliation. The relationship ended with a particularly painful scene that several witnesses later described to mutual acquaintances. She'd returned to the house, my former home, to collect her belongings, while Robert was at yet another meeting with his lawyers. Neighbors reported seeing her loading boxes into her car, while Robert arrived home to find her departure note on the kitchen counter. The man who destroyed a 40-year marriage for a chance at young love found himself completely alone, abandoned as casually as he'd abandoned me. Throughout this period of public vindication, I maintained what I hoped was quiet dignity. Reporters called my apartment frequently seeking interviews and statements, but I declined them all. I had no desire for revenge or public gloating. The truth was speaking loudly enough without my voice added to the chorus. My vindication didn't require my participation in their public humiliation. Instead, something unexpected began happening. Long-standing community members, people I'd known for years, but hadn't heard from during my darkest period, began reaching out with genuine expressions of support and regret. They visited my small apartment above Murphy's Diner, bringing casseroles and flowers, but more importantly, bringing their presence and their acknowledgement that they'd failed me when I'd needed them most. Margaret Henderson was among the first to visit, her face streaked with tears as she apologized for believing the lies about me, for not standing up for our friendship when it would have mattered. I should have known better, she kept repeating. 40 years of knowing you and I let them make me doubt what kind of person you really were. Others followed, women from my former church neighbors from Maple Street, even some of Robert's former colleagues who'd always respected me and were horrified to learn what had been done in their professional community. They didn't come offering pity, which I couldn't have accepted, but rather offering acknowledgement of an injustice and genuine friendship going forward. These visits became precious to me in ways I hadn't expected. Sitting in my modest apartment sharing simple meals and honest conversations, I began to understand that my public vindication, while important for clearing my name, was just the beginning of a longer process of rebuilding trust and connection with the world. Yet despite the outpouring of public sympathy and the complete restoration of my character in the community's eyes, I carried within me a profound sense of isolation that no amount of public support could completely heal. The experience had fundamentally changed my ability to trust completely, to love without reservation, to believe in the permanence of family bonds. Every new friendship, every kind gesture, every expression of support was filtered through the knowledge of how completely I'd been betrayed by the people who should have protected me most. The public vindication was a form of justice, certainly, but it had come too late to mend the deep internal wounds that would always mark me as someone who'd learned the hardest possible way that love and loyalty can be weaponized by those who understand your vulnerabilities most intimately. My truth was known now. My name cleared, my character restored in the eyes of everyone who mattered. But my heart remained marked by the knowledge that unconditional familial love, the kind I'd believed in and given freely for 40 years, was an illusion that some people never truly experience and others can have stripped away without warning. With the legal battles finally settled and their financial accountability ensured through court-ordered restitution, I began the slow, often painful process of building what would be my new life. The word rebuilding felt somehow insufficient for what I was attempting. This wasn't about reconstructing what had been destroyed, but rather about creating something entirely different from the fragments that remained. My small apartment above Murphy's Diner had initially felt like a temporary refuge, a place to hide while the legal storm raged around me. But as weeks turned to months, I began to see it differently. The two modest rooms with their secondhand furniture and tiny kitchenette weren't symbols of my diminished circumstances. They were proof of my survival evidence that I could create a home from almost nothing if necessary. I found unexpected solace in cultivating a small garden on the narrow balcony that overlooked Main Street. Working with my hands in the soil, nurturing tiny seedlings into flowering plants, became a daily meditation on growth and renewal. Each morning, I'd water my small collection of potted roses, herbs, and vegetables, watching for new growth and celebrating each small bloom as if it were a personal victory. The roses were particularly meaningful to me. These weren't cuttings from the climbing roses at my former home. I'd deliberately chosen different varieties, wanting flowers that belonged entirely to this new phase of my life. When they bloomed, for the first time small but vibrant, I understood that this garden was more than decoration. It was a living metaphor for my own healing proof that beautiful things could grow even in confined spaces, even after transplantation from more favorable conditions. I also began volunteering at the Sunset Manor Senior Center, initially because Catherine had suggested that community service might help with my emotional recovery. But what started as therapy for me quickly became something much more meaningful. Working with elderly residents who faced their own challenges, loneliness, health issues, family complications, gave me purpose beyond my own healing. There was something profound about helping others navigate difficulties that I understood intimately. When Margaret Wilson cried about her son's infrequent visits, I could offer comfort that came from true understanding rather than polite sympathy. When Harold Patterson expressed frustration about feeling invisible and irrelevant, I knew exactly the ache he was describing. My own suffering had given me a particular kind of empathy that proved valuable in ways I'd never anticipated. These interactions also led to genuine friendships that developed slowly and carefully. Eleanor continued to be my closest confidant, but I also grew close to Ruth Martinez, a widow who'd lost her husband to cancer, and understood the particular grief that comes from watching love transform into something unrecognizable. Our weekly coffee dates became anchors in my scheduled times when I could speak honestly about the challenges of starting over in one's 60s. Despite these new sources of meaning and connection, the painful memories of Robert Michael and Sarah's betrayal remained constantly present, like a chronic ache that occasionally flared into acute pain. Quiet evenings were the most difficult times, when the activity and purpose of my days gave way to solitude and reflection. Sometimes I would find myself rereading portions of my diary, not the entries that had served as evidence in court, but the earlier ones that documented happier times. Reading about Michael's childhood achievements, about anniversary dinners with Robert, about family vacations and holiday celebrations, brought tears that felt like they came from some inexhaustible well of grief. These weren't tears of self-pity, but rather a profound mourning for the life that had been, and the love I'd given so freely, believing it was treasured and returned. The betrayal hadn't just destroyed my present circumstances, it had contaminated my past, making even my happiest memories feel somehow tainted by the knowledge of what those relationships had actually meant to the people I'd loved most. There were nights when the weight of this realization felt almost unbearable. I would sit by my small window looking out at the quiet street below and feel the full impact of my isolation. Not the physical isolation, my days were often filled with meaningful activity and genuine human connection, but the deeper isolation that comes from understanding that the foundation of your entire adult life had been built on relationships that were fundamentally different from what you'd believed them to be. Yet amidst this persistent sorrow, small moments of authentic joy began to emerge with increasing frequency. These weren't the grand sweeping happiness I'd once known, but rather quiet, precious instances of contentment that felt particularly meaningful because they'd been hard-won. The genuine laughter shared with Ruth over coffee when she told stories about her late husband's cooking disasters. The quiet satisfaction of seeing my balcony roses bloom more fully with each passing week. The unexpected warmth I felt when helping a new resident at the senior center navigate their first difficult days away from home. These moments of joy existed not despite my suffering, but because of it. They were more precious because I understood how rare and fragile genuine connection truly was. I also received occasional updates about Robert Michael and Sarah through the inevitable gossip networks of a small community. Their lives had indeed collapsed under the weight of their own actions, creating a kind of natural justice that required no intervention from me. Robert's accounting practice had failed completely when his remaining clients lost confidence in his integrity. He'd been forced to sell our former home to pay legal fees and restitution, eventually moving to a small rental across town. Michael's banking career had ended abruptly when his professional licenses were revoked following a state investigation. He and Sarah had moved away from our community entirely, apparently hoping to start fresh somewhere their reputation hadn't preceded them. The expensive lifestyle they'd planned to fund with stolen assets had transformed into financial struggle and social anonymity. These updates didn't bring me satisfaction or vindication. They simply confirmed that actions have consequences, that the universe has its own way of balancing scales without requiring victims to actively seek revenge. Their suffering felt separate from my healing proof that justice and personal peace could exist independently of each other. As autumn approached, marking nearly a full year since this nightmare had begun, I realized that my new life, while fundamentally different from anything I'd previously imagined, had developed its own rhythm and meaning. I wasn't the same person who'd received those divorce papers in her kitchen a year earlier, and I never would be again. But the person I'd become, scarred but stronger, wiser but warier alone, but not without connection, was someone I was beginning to understand and even respect. On a particularly beautiful evening in early October, I sat on my small balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and my garden, though modest, was enjoying its final burst of color before winter's arrival. The roses I'd planted with such hope months earlier had exceeded my expectations, creating a small riot of pink and red blooms that seemed to celebrate their own resilience. From a nearby apartment, I could hear music drifting through an open window, an old song from the 40s that Robert and I had danced to during our courtship. "I'll Be Seeing You" played softly on what sounded like an old radio, the melody carrying memories of a time when we were young and everything seemed possible. Instead of changing my position to escape the music, I found myself sitting still and letting the familiar notes wash over me. The song brought back vivid memories of Saturday nights in our small first apartment when money was tight, but love felt abundant. I could almost see Robert as he'd been then, young, earnest, full of dreams about the life we'd build together. We'd dance in our tiny living room, making plans for the future that seemed as solid and certain as the ground beneath our feet. For the first time since this ordeal began, I didn't fight the flood of bittersweet memories. I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd lost, not just the money and property, but the decades of shared history, the inside jokes, the comfortable silences, the sense of being part of something larger than myself. I let myself grieve for the young woman who'd believed so completely in forever, and for the family I'd thought we were building together. But as I sat there, something fundamental shifted in my understanding of this grief. The sorrow I felt wasn't just about their betrayal. It was about the complete loss of innocence, the end of my ability to love without reservation or trust without question. These were wounds that would never fully heal, scars that would always mark me as someone who'd learned life's hardest lessons through direct experience. Yet for the first time, I found myself accepting this reality without fighting against it. The scars weren't failures of healing. They were evidence of battles, survived proof that I'd faced the worst kind of betrayal and emerged with my integrity intact. The inability to trust completely wasn't a limitation. It was wisdom earned through suffering a protection that might prevent future devastation. I realized that I'd been approaching my healing with the expectation that recovery meant returning to who I'd been before regaining the capacity for unconditional love and absolute trust that had characterized my relationships with Robert and Michael. But sitting in the gathering dusk, listening to that old song, I understood that true healing might mean something entirely different. True healing meant learning to carry the weight of these experiences with grace, to acknowledge the scars without letting them define my entire existence. It meant understanding that life could still be meaningful and beautiful even when filtered through the knowledge of human capacity for cruelty. It meant finding freedom not in the absence of pain, but in the ability to live fully despite its persistent presence. This quiet acceptance brought a deeper level of peace than I'd experienced since this nightmare began. The ache in my heart for the family I'd lost would always be there. It had become part of me, woven into the fabric of who I was. But that ache no longer felt like something to overcome or cure. Instead, it felt like the price of having loved deeply, the inevitable consequence of investing 40 years in relationships that turned out to be different from what I'd believed them to be. I could still find beauty in the world around me. The sunset before me was no less magnificent because I was viewing it alone. The roses in my small garden were no less lovely because they'd grown from seeds of necessity rather than leisure. The friendships I'd developed were no less meaningful because they'd been forged in the aftermath of betrayal rather than in the innocence of youth. As the last light faded from the sky and the music from the neighboring apartment grew quiet, I rose from my chair with a sense of profound acceptance. My future wouldn't be a restoration of what had been lost. It would be something entirely new, built on the foundation of hard-won wisdom and the understanding that resilience isn't about bouncing back to your original shape, but about finding new forms of strength and beauty. I envisioned the months and years ahead, not as a grand adventure or a triumphant comeback, but as a quiet tapestry woven with both joy and sorrow, light and shadow. I would continue working with the elderly residents at the senior center, finding purpose in easing their loneliness and sharing the comfort that comes from genuine understanding. I would tend my small garden, celebrating each bloom as evidence that beautiful things can grow even in the most constrained circumstances. There would be difficult days ahead, anniversaries that brought sharp pangs of loss, unexpected reminders of the family that no longer existed, moments when the weight of solitude felt almost unbearable. But there would also be quiet joys, laughter shared with true friends, the satisfaction of helping someone through a difficult time, the simple pleasure of watching my roses bloom year after year. Most importantly, I would carry forward the knowledge that my worth hadn't been determined by their betrayal, that my capacity for love hadn't been diminished by their inability to return it honestly. The woman who'd been systematically destroyed by her husband and son had emerged with her essential self-intact, scarred, but unbroken alone, but not without value. Standing on my small balcony as full darkness settled over the town, I felt a profound sense of integration, not healing in the sense of returning to a previous state, but evolution into someone who could hold both sorrow and joy loss, and hope, betrayal, and trust within the same heart. This wasn't the life I'd planned or expected, but it was unmistakably mine, earned through suffering, and built with intention, marked by visible scars, but animated by an enduring spirit that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. My new life, though inherently different from what I once envisioned, has found its own rhythm of quiet fulfillment. It's not the complete family or comfortable home I once dreamed of sharing with Robert and Michael, but rather something carved from immense betrayal and profound loss, and somehow that makes it more precious. I've discovered a deep self-sufficiency I never knew I possessed, a wisdom gleaned from exploring the darkest corners of human nature, and an appreciation for the genuine connections that can be forged through shared understanding of life's challenges. I am stronger now, wiser, and undeniably changed by what I've endured. The scars of my husband and son's treachery remain visible in the way I pause before trusting in the careful boundaries I maintain around my heart in the moments when grief still catches me unexpectedly. These marks have shaped me, but they no longer define me. They are part of my story, evidence of battles fought and survived, but not the entirety of who I am. The woman who sits on this small balcony, tending roses and finding purpose in helping others navigate their own difficulties, bears little resemblance to the wife and mother who received those divorce papers in her kitchen so many months ago. That woman believed in unconditional love and permanent bonds. This woman understands that love must be tempered with wisdom, that trust must be earned and re-earned, that family can be chosen as well as inherited. Life has taught me that even the purest loyalty can be met with the darkest deceit, and that some wounds never truly heal. The ache of losing not just Robert and Michael, but the illusion of who I thought they were, will always remain. Yet I've learned that true peace isn't found in the absence of pain or in dreams of revenge, but in accepting what is, while refusing to let betrayal poison what could still be. It's about finding the quiet strength to carry your sorrows with grace, while remaining open to new joys, new connections, new possibilities for meaning. It's about discovering that integrity, the alignment between who you are and how you live, cannot be stolen by others, only surrendered by yourself. Some wounds never truly heal, but they remind us of the battles we've survived and the strength we didn't know we possessed. And sometimes that quiet resilience, that enduring echo of a woman's unshakable integrity, is more than enough.